Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. We are here for our last installment of our Canadian Whisky certification classes, week 4. You made it. A special hello to all of our students. I see you all in the comments already. Thank you for joining us. You're killing it. So we are joined again by Gina, Dave, and of course, Ricky. Our last class today will be about the misconceptions between blended and rye Canadian whiskey. But more on that in just a minute. Just a reminder, whether you're joining us on Portland Cocktail Week's Facebook, Camp Run Amok's Facebook, or Portland Cocktail Week's YouTube page, make sure to like and subscribe. We have more content like this coming in the rest of the year, so keep up with us there. And then I'm going to toss it over to Gina and Dave to give us another reminder of Ricky's amazing service to us here today, and then we'll get straight into class. So Gina and Dave.
Hi, everyone. It's such an exciting week and a little bit of a sad week, too, because we've been having so much fun for the last month with you all. But, you know, this isn't the end. This just means I'll be back on the road traveling and we'll get to come sit at your bars and your restaurants and come see you all. It's very exciting. And yeah, as Liz mentioned, don't forget, we got Ricky here. He's here for all of your Spanish needs. Anything you could possibly need, let him know, and we will have everything translated. We've got a lot to go through today, 4 different whiskeys to taste. We're going to hand it over to the professor. Professor Foster.
Oh boy, here we go. Last class, everybody. So let's dive in, shall we? We are going to start with blended whiskey today. So first we're going to talk about a blender's palate. Not his tasting palate or her tasting palate, but more like the artist palette that they're working with. Now, we're going to kind of look at everything that can be manipulated throughout the process as the pigments on the artist palette. Okay, so first, and a lot of this should be review from the past 3 weeks, but first we're going to look at grain. We can manipulate what grains we're using, right? At Hiram Walker, we're using corn, wheat, rye, barley, malted rye, malted barley. Fermentation, we can manipulate how long the fermentation is, the temperature, what yeast we're using, how much nitrogen we're putting into that fermentation to help the process along. Distillation styles, we know, produce different flavor compounds. Single column distillation is going to give us that nice full-bodied spirit. Double column is going to strip out that grain and yeast characters. And going from a column into a pot still allows us to really concentrate up certain flavor compounds, especially the grain, fruity and floral notes. Maturation, we can manipulate the ABV it's going into the barrels, type of wood we're using to get different flavor compounds to come to life or not. Time it's in the barrel, of course. Are we using a finishing barrel and letting previous liquid come into our whiskey? And the terroir of our warehouses and the aging environment that our whiskey is going through. And then bottling as well. What ABV are we bottling the whiskey at? Because different flavor compounds will come to life at different strengths. And filtration as well, whether or not we're filtering it, which for our 100 certification students, Dr. Don is going to get into that in detail tomorrow in your private workshop session. Okay, let's talk about the blend now. So our artist here, Mr. Bob Ross, we will use as an example, our wonderful artist, has painted us this very layered, complex blend. And, the size of the barrel here in this illustration is representing the amount of this particular whiskey in the blend. So for instance, this double column distilled corn whiskey that is aged in brand new American barrels. So we have very light style, and then we're going to have a lot of wood influence coming into that whiskey. That's going to make up the majority of this blend, you can see there. Secondly, a single column distilled rye. So a nice full-bodied rye, giving us nice spice notes. aged in once used bourbon casks, so giving us those dried fruit notes in the maturation, almost an equal amount, not quite, but a lot of rye going into this as well. Another type of rye that's pot distilled in brand new oak. Remember tasting lot 40? That's lot 40 right there. Two different styles of wheat whiskeys. You've got that single column in brand new oak and a pot distilled wheat in brand new oak as well. So some nice bready notes coming into this blend. And then also two different barley whiskeys, right? Single column distilled in bourbon cask and pot distilled in brand new oak. So we're getting a lot of layers in this blend. 7 different distillates is what I would call that. What whiskey is this? Does anybody have a guess? I'm going to tell you. It is Gooderham and Worts. Okay, so we're going to look at this a little more closely in a little bit, but just kind of keeping in mind artistically how we're looking at these blends. Okay, so let's talk about our master blender a little bit. For any of our certification students, you were all introduced to our master blender, Dr. Don Livermore, last week in our maturation workshop private session. And you will get to spend time with him tomorrow as well. But just to review who Dr. Don is, he has his PhD in brewing and distilling from Harriet Watt. He is a microbiologist. He's worked at the distillery at Hiram Walker for 25 years. He has done almost every production job there is there. So he really understands the process. And he does look at it as a science, as a microbiologist, right? But he also has the job of artistically putting these blends together. And so we have a little video here of Don kind of explaining how he uses his flavor wheel that he created to look at flavor both molecularly and as an artist's palette.
Hi, I'm Dr. Don Livermore, Master Blender for the Hiram Walker Distillery. I'll often get asked the question, what makes a Master Blender? How do you become a Master Blender? You have to understand where Canadian whiskey has come from and the methodologies previous Master Blenders have put into place to bring it all together and why we do the things we do today. It's not about years of service, it's not about being trained by the best master blender in the world, and it's not about going to school. The most important thing for a master blender is listening to the customer and consumer. It's not about making whiskey for me, it's about making whiskey for you. And the tool that we use is the Canadian Whisky Flavor Wheel, which I developed in 2017 in coordination with the LCBO. For my mindset as a blender, I'm thinking about 3 things. It's either the grain, the fermentation, or the barrel. The second ring of that whiskey flavor wheel are the things that I can manipulate. I can change the fermentation parameters in the environment for the yeast, like pH or nutrients. I can change the grains around, corn, wheat, rye, or barley. If I want to dial up the spiciness, I increase the rye in our blend. We can change the barrel. I can change the way it's burned. It can give different flavor profiles. I can change the type of barrel that we use. The third ring of the flavor wheel are the things that you care about. Those are the flavor descriptors. Banana, pineapple, caramel, toffee. The things I think about is the outside ring of that flavor wheel. Those are the molecular compounds that I measure to bring in the final whiskey you see here. I hope you have a new appreciation for what it's like to be a master blender in the Canadian whiskey category. The flavor wheel is like an artist's palette. You try to marry all those components together and have an understanding what choices you're making today can affect 20 years later. It's about leaving your legacy behind. I want to thank you for supporting our brands all the way from Canada. Cheers, eh?
Okay, so that was Dr. Don and kind of explaining his flavor wheel to everyone. So let's take a look at that flavor wheel a little more closely and revisit Gooderham and Worts. And so what Dr. Don does is now study the molecular structure in the lab on some fancy dancy lab equipment. But he really breaks it down and puts it into a bar graph called a polar histogram that sits on top of this flavor wheel. And without further ado, I'm going to let Dave Mitten take us through a tasting of Gooder Hemmenworts while we are looking at this polar histogram.
Thank you, Gina Fawcett. I had to unmute there. I forgot to do that. Hi, everyone. I hope you all have some Gooder Hemmenworts left over from this week. I know mine's kind of low. My little bottle was almost empty. Thank you, Liz. Gooder Hemmenworts. So grab your bottle, fill up your glass. We have gone through this beautiful golden color. Let's revisit this again. We have talked about its history and Gooder Hemmenworts, but Gina's little blender palette that she just with Mr. Ross kind of took us through the 7 distillates and 4 grains. And looking at this flavor wheel, sorry if I'm looking down because my copy in front of me, the printing's a little small. I think it's the same one you guys have, but your eyes are probably better than mine. First thing I get nosing it, I get all the beautiful like bready wheat. And I mean, looking at your flavor wheel and the diagram around it, where's the dark blue? What is that big blue? That is where the casks, the wood, that's everything you're getting from all the new American oak, the vanilla, toffee, caramel, the ex-bourbon cask, dried fruit notes. I mean, you look up at your grains over here on the right, and you've got a whole, see, it's rye. I'm sorry, I'm not looking at you. I'm looking down at here, but the majority of this blend is that big pot distilled rye. And with the rye, you're getting like the baking spices, rye bread, breadiness of the wheat, nuttiness of the barley, all your yeast over to the left. Looking at that, you're getting lots of floral, fruity notes, a little bit of green grass, obviously finished wood finish as well, the dried fruit from the bourbon. I don't know if anyone's even sipped it yet, but you've got to have it. Bananas, yes, I always get that too, and I find that's kind of from the rye. So good one, Robin. And what you're smelling and tasting, you're not wrong. We all have different palates. So breadiness of wheat, nuttiness of barley. My first sip, I certainly get that soft, rich creaminess of the corn. I get the warmth of that rye spice, the nice sensation. Fresh cherry from the tree. You guys should be writing some of our tasting notes. This whiskey, as we discussed before, it's a perfect sipper. We've noticed bourbon drinkers gravitate towards this one. So it's beautiful on its own, but it holds up when you're making classic cocktails. Bartenders in Toronto can be a little cheeky where it's Toronto's whiskey unofficially, make a Toronto cocktail. Bitter variation of a Manhattan. Works great in whiskey sours as well. I mean, works great in all your classic cocktails. It holds up. To me, it's the closest to a Canadian whiskey gets to a bourbon. There you go. I mean, made exactly opposite, as Gina just walked you through, where bourbon blends in the beginning and our master blender and everyone at the distillery, Amy, creates everything on its own, and then we blend together at the end. Great analogy. Would just drink this on its own. So do I. Grassy notes. Yeah, are you guys agreeing with you've got your flavor wheel in front of you, I'm assuming, in your kit. There was a flavor wheel. Cinnamon. Absolutely. So you can, I don't know if you've even played with this. And this isn't something that I reach for every day, but when I do, and maybe Gina, maybe you do, but this flavor wheel, it is fun. Even I've used it with other types of whiskeys too, just to kind of pair it up and see if it works. It really is, as Dawn will get into it a lot more detailed tomorrow. He built it in the view of a master blender, which we will say in the beginning, I think even brand teams were concerned that the average consumer, it might have been overwhelming, but we've noticed over the years that we've had this out, people get it. It's pretty easy to read. I mean, scientific minds get a kick out of it, but it's pretty self-explanatory.
Thanks, Dave. Let's go back to Bob. Let's visit Bob again, shall we? And let's see what he's going to paint us this time. We're going to visit a different blend. It is J.P. Weiser's Triple Barrel Rye. So as we're going through this, you might want to get your Triple Barrel Rye out to taste if you have it. But this now seems like a much simpler blend, right? But very different, 3 very different whiskeys going into it. So you see the majority of this is that single column, full bodied rye with those dried fruit notes coming from the bourbon barrels. Then you have a decent amount of corn here. That's double column distilled, so very light style. Use Canadian barrels on those, so super light style whiskey here, kind of acting more as a glue on these big flavoring whiskeys. And then wheat, a concentrated pot distilled bready notes from this wheat whiskey, aged in brand new American oak. So nice vanilla, caramel, even a little coconut going in there from those barrels, right? Okay, so back to our flavor wheel. Here is Triple Barrel Rye sitting on the polar histogram. And I think that we should taste this, Dave, while we have the polar histogram up.
Let's do it, Professor. And JP Weiser's Triple Barrel Rye, you guys, I'm sure it's all instilled in your brain now. Traditional Canadian whiskey being that majority amount of soft double column distilled corn with a little pinch of rye. This expression, again, is only sold in the U.S. If there's any Canadian bartenders on here right now, well, there are, I know that. We have a Triple Barrel Rye in Canada, but it's a different formula. What you're tasting right now wouldn't be on the same shelves here in Canada, Ontario, wherever you are. This was made with the American palate in mind. It is, as Gina mentioned, you've got 60% once column distilled rye. You've got 37% of that soft corn, 3% of the pot distilled wheat. So, I mean, right away, look at the polar histogram, like the big green right there. That's wood, that's finish. You've got triple barrels. You're getting all of the warming, sweet vanilla toffee caramel from the new American oak. You're getting the dried fruit notes from the ex-bourbon casks. You're getting autumn florals from the ex-Canadian Whisky Cask, which accentuates all the grain and yeast characteristics. I mean, right away, I just personally kind of, you've heard me say this before, I get that little bit of a creme brulee thing from some of the J.P. Weiser's brands, but this is heavy on rye bread. Right away. I mean, you look at the grain, look at that. That is all rye right there. Everything you're getting from it. Cinnamon spice, cloves. Someone just said toasted marshmallow. Josh just asked what the, I don't know if you asked what the mash bill was before I said it, but I'll again, just in case you didn't hear, or 60% once column distilled rye, 37% of that soft corn, 3% of the pot distilled wheat. So, I mean, you're getting all the rye spice up front. You're getting a lot of that corn, little touch of breadiness in the background. This is one, I mean, it holds its own if you're mixing it in a classic cocktail, like a Manhattan, old fashioned. It's a great example of a blended rye whiskey, and it's very unique for a Canadian whiskey to have such a high percentage of rye. That's just not, it's not a thing, to be honest, in Canada. I can't speak for all of the small boutique distilleries across Canada. There's about 300 of them. But as far as big brands and names go, having a high rye content like that is not run of the mill.
Cool. Yeah. All right. Should we move on to rye while we're talking about rye?
Yes.
All right, let's do it. We'll save all the questions till the end, yeah?
Yep, works for me.
Okay. So let's just talk about Canadian rye specifically and what does that mean? And we've really kind of already touched on this, but now we're going to talk about rye specifically, not just traditional styles of Canadian whiskey. So remember back in week 1 to our history session, when we talked about in the 1800s, we had, the English primarily distilling wheat, softer, sweeter style of grain. The Germans bringing with them their ability to distill rye, and cultures mixing and innovation happening, and a little bit of rye going in there, right? 5 to 10%. So a rye from way back when, from the beginning of Canadian whiskey, once they started incorporating rye, it really just meant, that there was a little bit in there. There was no minimum amount. There's no 51% regulation in Canada, and that's due to this history, right? You either ordered a whiskey that was 100% wheat or corn, or you ordered a rye, which was 100% wheat and a tiny bit of rye in it. That drastically upped that spice level in the whiskeys. And now when we look at the regulations, back to week 1 again, right? They're titled Canadian Whisky, Canadian Rye Whisky, or Rye Whisky. That's the whole title of the one set of regulations in Canada. And you can see by repeating Rye Whisky twice how influential that really became to the category once that was introduced. So because of the production styles in Canada, we really end up having a lot of different styles of what could be considered Canadian rye. We look at J.P. Weiser's 10-year-old as a great example of a traditional style that someone in Canada especially would call it a rye. It's very little rye, 10 to 15% in there, primarily corn. But that qualifies as a Canadian rye. Triple barrel rye that you just tasted, this would be a rye blend that is primarily rye, 60% rye whiskey in there. So very rye forward, but some other grains coming into the flavor profile as well. And then we look at one distillate being bottled on its own, one whiskey, 100% rye, which is Lot 40. And we've tasted that earlier in the course. We are going to taste it again today, so we'll get to that in a little bit. Okay, so, we like to compare Canadian to American whiskeys because that is where most of our misconceptions come from, right? Is thinking that all North American whiskeys are produced the same or something. I'm not sure, but let's compare side by side, going through talking about rye whiskey specifically. So in Canada, we're looking traditionally, and most of your big houses are going to produce about 100% grain builds, right? So they're either going to make a blend on their rye whiskeys or bottle up 100% rye, which isn't super common, to be quite honest. And in the US, we know our minimum regulation in rye whiskey is 51% rye in the mash bill, when you're making that mash bill right up front in the beginning of the process. It's usually going to have barley and sometimes other grains, usually some malted barley in there to help the fermentation process along. And the grains are going to be blended, during the mash. So during the cook, during the mash, to create a mash bill. So you're seeing a blending of grains in the beginning where you're not seeing that in Canada so much. Now, as far as fermentation goes, when we talk about enzymes, because we're doing 100% grain builds in Canada, we need exogenous enzymes. We don't have malted barley in 100% rye whiskey, right? So we're going to need some exogenous enzymes to help break down these large starch strains so that the yeast can feed on them and eventually produce alcohol and some flavor compounds for us. In the US, you're going to see both endogenous from within the malted barley grain, if it's in that mash bill, and exogenous. Now, usually, depending on how much malted barley is in the mash bill, you're usually going to see exogenous enzymes used as well, because typically 10% malted barley isn't quite enough to really move that fermentation process along. So a lot of times you're going to see, some exogenous enzymes used as well in American whiskeys. When we look at distillation styles, we see a lot of different distillation styles across Canada. Your most common would be double column distilled, sometimes even triple column distilled, really stripping out the flavor. You wouldn't even know it's a rye whiskey at that point. Column distilled, single column distilled. This is much like your big house American rye whiskeys would be made. Most of them, not all of them, but most of them. Or you're going to see a column distillation and then taking that batch into a pot distillation. Now, those are your most common. Of course, there's combo stills and all kinds of fun things, hybrid stills going on. But those are your most common distillation practices in Canada for making rye. In the US, we cannot exceed 160 proof. That's because American whiskey likes to be very grain forward. So to keep those grain flavor compounds in the whiskey, we don't want to distill it too high. That would start stripping out those grain flavors. Most are going to use a column still, so that's single column distillation, just like we talked about that style in Canadian whiskey. And then a lot of times it'll be run through a doubler in the US. What that means is, a doubler it acts as a second distillation, but almost like a very quick pot distillation. And you can run a pretty large batch through a doubler in like 30 minutes. It's very quick. And what you're doing is two things, possibly, depending on your purpose for the doubler, but you're going to increase your ABV. The more you just distill something, the higher ABV you're going to end up with. But also, you might be getting more copper contact. Maybe your column still doesn't have a ton of copper in it. Might be stainless steel, might have copper plates or copper wiring at the top. But you might need more copper contact to remove some of those sulfur compounds that we talked about a few weeks ago. So that doubler can help with that as well, giving you more copper contact. And usually you're not going to see any cut points on this style being made. Some are doing it, but a lot of times you won't see cut points made. And, on our single column distillation at Hiram Walker, we're not doing cut points either. All of that liquid, typically in this style, will go into the bottle at the end of the day. Maturation. Remember, all Canadian whiskey, so that includes rye, has to be aged a minimum of 3 years in small oak. Now, it doesn't say what type of oak or how it has to be charred or toasted or at all, but minimum of 3-year aging in small, less than 700-liter casks. In the US, for rye whiskey, there really isn't a minimum age requirement. So, you have to age it in brand new charred oak, but there's no minimum age. So you could age it for 5 minutes, you could age it for 1 month, you could age it for 2 years, you could age it for 20 years. There's no minimum requirement unless you are labeling it as a straight rye whiskey. And straight whiskeys in the US have to have a minimum of 2 years aging. And then let's just look at blending. We're not talking about blended whiskey as we did earlier, but it sort of crosses over, especially when we're talking about Canadian whiskey, right? Because in Canadian whiskey, if we're going to have different grains going in and we're building them at 100% grain build whiskeys, then we're going to be making a blended rye. So we'll blend different whiskeys, different ages, different cask types, to produce very specific flavor profiles, right? And for the most part, we're going to blend the liquid after maturation. Some are doing it before maturation, but for the most part in Canada, you'll see blending happening after maturation. And you're also, for the most part, going to see single distillery blends coming out of Canada. And that's because, because we're producing 100% rye, 100% wheat, 100% barley, etc. No one wants to kind of get stuck on just having 100% of one grain. You want more flavor to work with at the end of the day and produce other flavor profiles down the road. So most distilleries are going to be producing several different grains, several different whiskeys. And so then they have the capability to produce single distillery blends for the most part. Now, when we look at, blending, especially when it comes to rye as a category in the US, we have kind of been trained to talk about this as mingling, not blending, but it is the same thing. You are blending different barrels or multiple barrels of whiskey, but you're going to typically see the same mash bill being blended, because a lot of distilleries will make one rye mash bill and one bourbon mash bill, or they might make a few, but typically you're going to see one mash bill being blended or mingled, maybe different ages coming from the warehouse, but same barrel type, because it's got to be brand new charred oak. So for the most part, we're seeing the same barrel type going into these blends to produce specific flavor profiles. So a little less freedom in what the flavor profile can become, except when you start blending different mash bills, which we can do. So completely different whiskeys, but as long as they're both by regulation rye whiskeys, we do not in the US have to label it a blended rye or blended whiskey. We can label it a rye whiskey or a straight American rye, even though we are blending completely different whiskeys that are completely different mash bills. Our regulations do not require that we label it a blended whiskey like we would need to do in Canada. Finally, why rye? What's all the hype with rye whiskey? Well, this comes straight from Dr. Don Livermore, our master blender. So this is, basically the plant fiber that we're talking about. Much like when we talk about it with wood, it's the same composition: cellulose, hemicellulose, and lignin. Rye has more lignin than any other grain. And what that means is that when you break it down, so here's lignin, this giant molecule. When we break it down by heating it, we break this molecule apart through cooking, through distillation. It's going to break apart into these different flavor compounds: guaiacol, creosol, et cetera, eugenol. You're going to end up getting these nice flavor compounds coming to life: clove, wood, leather spice, spicy sweet smoke, burnt, smoky, bacony, all kinds of things. And then if we pot distill it, we're heating it again, right? And we're also concentrating by making more cut points. So we get more lignin broken apart, more spicy flavors coming to life. And if we go back to our flavor wheel and we look at the rye section, that second ring, go to rye on your grains, go to the third ring. Every single one of those descriptors starts with the word spicy. Rye means spicy, whether that be black pepper spicy or cinnamon spicy or clove spicy, smoky spicy. Rye means spicy in your whiskey. And I think we have two wonderful ryes to kind of take us through. We can kind of talk back, Dave, through triple barrel rye as an example, but then really diving into the next two, I think would be great for our tasting.
I think so too, Professor. And I was going to say, it's good to touch back on the JP Weiss's triple barrel rye for a moment. Because I noticed someone, Josh was saying apricot jam on toast, which I love that. Sarah mentioned not as astringent as most ryes come off. And it is. It's very different from, what you think of as an American rye. It is 45 ABV, so still 90 proof compared to Canadian whiskeys. That's pretty high. We're talking the triple barrel still at this moment. But But where it's got all the rye flavors, it still kind of has a softness to it too. Like I mean, it's that corn, so it doesn't pack too much of a punch, but holds its own when making cocktails. And I mean, I think this is worth mentioning. We don't talk prices really in this course, and I don't think the Canadians are want to hear this, but that triple barrel rye you just had, that's $19 a bottle. Like, it's a pretty, as somebody who used to do costing, $20 for a bottle of rye to that quality, I think it's pretty great. And that's, again, just in the US. Sorry, Canadian friends. I apologize. But anyway, here we go. Speaking of Canadian friends, Lot 40 that we're going to try next, you got your pretty little bottles right here. The reason this whiskey is where it's at today, one of the main reasons was back in 2012, when they released this whiskey, when Corby Spirit and Wine, I did not work for them. I had my little restaurants, and someone walked in, sales rep, and presented me a bottle and said, "This is one of our new Canadian whiskeys." And I tried it and looked at her and said, "This isn't a Canadian whiskey," and looked at the bottle. I'm like, "Oh, it is." That person at the time didn't have a lot of information, but all I knew of back in 2012 of Canadian whiskeys, they were very light. Corn, a little bit of rye. They weren't really used in cocktails a lot at that point in time. This being that 100% rye grain, I mean, rye in its purest form, I'm talking unmalted rye, column distilled once, stripping the harsh qualities and characteristics away. Pot distilled afterwards in that 8,000 liter still Gina has told you about, for 12 hours. And with the pot distillation for 12 hours, it's pretty accurate cuts. The heads come off. That's basically getting rid of the green grassy characteristics. The tails come off. I mean, that's getting rid of the soapy characteristics. Nothing is wrong with that in a whiskey. We just chose to keep the hearts for this one. And that is all the citrus and floral notes, the rye spices, the rye bread, the baking spices, cinnamon, cloves, baking spices. I'm getting excited. And it's still rye. It packs a bit of a punch. So we put this down in brand new American oak, level 2 char, and it brings out the warming vanilla and toffee caramels that goes so well with the rye bread. Tames the beast, rounds it out. I mean, here we are. We should try this. Beautiful amber color. I'm just seeing what everyone's saying here. I'm in love with Lot 42. Gina knows this, and it gets talked about too often, but I sold enough of this at my little spots that Corby did approach to me and said, "What's going on? Like, no one is selling more of this than you in Canada," which sounded more impressive at the time because it wasn't really being sold in Canada. And this is where I'm getting to Canadian bartenders specifically at the moment. Toronto bartenders. I know, boo, Toronto, center of the universe. But they got a hold of this whiskey first, and they used it like crazy. I mean, there's people on this class right now. I think Elise is here from Bar Raval. She's run that place and always used this as their house whiskey. This has become a real common cocktail whiskey in Canada. Seen it a lot more in Europe and UK. And we're starting to see it in the US, and hopefully you guys can help us. It's beautiful, holds its own against herbal liqueurs, big vermouths, Amaros, but it's got this delicate side to it. That pot distillation, the new oak, that it goes great in like tall, refreshing drinks as well.
Dave, we do have a question.
I'm too excited. Question, hit me.
I'm going to hit you with a question. Okay, so is Lot 40 your only staple product that is bottled as single grain rather than a blend?
Before I answer that, somebody just said grandma's purse. That is brilliant. I love that, and I'm stealing it. That is amazing. It is not. It is not the only single grain whiskey, because I know we've gone through a lot. But if you remember, that J.P. Weiser's 18-year-old is 100% soft column distilled corn. All corn. Soft corn. I'm really saying C. Corn. Now, and it's almost a perfect example because that's the softest, lightest whiskey we have, the J.P. Weiser's 18, in my opinion. And Lot 40, I mean, this is a big 100% rye whiskey. So completely opposite ends of the spectrum, but are two 100% grain whiskeys.
Mm-hmm. And if you remember, back to week 2 when we did production, that's when we really learned about the style of Canadian whiskey production at 100% grain builds. That's why those were the 2 whiskeys that week to taste, because they are our 100% very light double column distilled corn versus 100% big, bold, butterscotchy rye, right?
And there's actually, Lucas made a comment here saying he remembers in 2010 in Toronto, a lot of the cocktail bars used Dark Horse. Now, I'm not saying that's incorrect. What I remember was it was a different whiskey from out west, and it had the name Alberta in the whiskey. It wasn't the Dark Horse. Dark Horse is infamous where they use the 9.09 rule, rye that they blend in, sherry, and wine. But I like where Lucas is going with this, because there is another brand of 100% rye whiskey in Canada that double column distills it, which back in 2010, I was one of the bartenders and bar owners that was using this whiskey because it said on the label 100% rye, and we got very excited. And there's still a couple of very well-known cocktail bars in Toronto right now that still uses it. It's a great whiskey, but it's double column distilled. So remember, that's stripping away all of the big flavors from the grain that we do with our corn. So it's kind of one of those things. It's almost, Dawn might talk about this tomorrow. There's not a lot of reason to use something like a big rye and strip its flavor away and then put it up against a big vermouth or herbal liqueur to make a Manhattan or a Bucade. So great one, Lucas.
Another question, and I'll take this one, being the American in the session. But just for comparison, which rye profile does Canadian rye lean toward more, Maryland or Pennsylvania style? Honestly, I wouldn't say either. Canadian rye, if we kind of think back to what we were just talking about, first of all, it can be so many different styles because we have the ability. There's no minimum requirement, right? So we have the ability to make so many different styles, and we do. But remember, kind of traditionally really what Canadian whiskey is known for, or Canadian rye, is being a softer, lighter, sweeter style, primarily corn with a little bit of rye. So really neither of those styles would really fit what the bulk of Canadian rye would be. However, some of those, some Canadian whiskeys certainly would match up to a Pennsylvania or a Maryland style, depending on how they're made. Okay, should we go on to dark oak? I feel like we should.
We probably should.
Yeah.
These folks don't have all day.
So excited for this one, guys. So excited.
All right. So I just love these cute little labels. Look at that. I get the Dr. Dawn thing, putting it in your face. But say the dark oak. We haven't tasted this yet on this course, have we, Tina? Okay.
No, this is our big finish, Dave. Our big finish.
Love it. Dark oak. So you kind of get the story of Lot 40 earlier in this course, how it it didn't do well in the 90s, kind of exploded in the early 2010s. We're in a place now where it's, the honest God truth is, like, volume wise around the planet, it's not very big with consumers, but it's got a cult following with whiskey geeks and mostly even more so bartenders. So that makes me happy. Wherever I go, I can find it in a lot of cocktail bars, have a drink made with it, which is great. Now, the dark oak, Dr. Dawn has a lot of fun because of this cult following with bartenders and whiskey aficionados, where he'll release cask strengths. He'll release different age cask strengths. He'll do barrel finish cask strengths. He did a Lot 40 cask strength peated quarter cask last year. I know next October there's a pretty cool Lot 40 I might get in trouble for saying it, but it's a port finished cask strength lot 40 coming out next October. I've tried it. It's amazing. Like, we've got some cool stuff coming down the line. So he's always putting out different expressions. He put out Lot 40 Dark Oak. The timing couldn't have been any better when we released it. We released it in April 2020. So we all know what was happening back then. The world was closing down for a whiskey that is a bartender following, and what dark oak is. So again, Lot 40, 100% unmalted rye, column and pot distilled, aged in new American oak, char level or char number 2. Lot 40 dark oak is regauged in char level 4 on new American oak, and it's bottled at 96 ABV. Sorry, 96 ABV, 96 proof. Wait, that's right, isn't it, Gina? What is it?
Yep.
Yep, 96 proof. So it's got a little more punch. I mean, it's got almost like a sweet vanilla ice cream to it instead of with this extra char. It's got cinnamon. It packs more of a punch, but it's got a sweet softness more than the original Lot 40, if that makes sense. I mean, I get cinnamon on those right away. And again, 96 proof, this isn't packing a punch. It's still got a real softness to it. You feel that nice warming sensation. Needless to say, this works brilliantly in a lot of cocktails. What's up, leather and candied burnt bacon? Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
This is just one of our favorites. And so to continue the story, it was released during the pandemic. It was a one-off. Like, we just made, I think, a couple thousand bottles, and that was it. Brand teams, I'm sure a lot of you know how this works. Brand teams always send samples to whiskey award shows around the world, hoping you'll get a silver or gold, and you can put it on a neck tag in a retail store, and customers will want to buy something because it says gold medal. World Whiskey Awards out of the UK reached out to us and said, congratulations, you've won World's Best Rye. And we kind of misunderstood. We're like, oh, cool, we've won World's Best Canadian Whiskey. And they write back, like, no, we're giving you World's Best Rye this year, which, again, during the pandemic was very exciting, a little frustrating. That was in 2021. We don't hold the title anymore, but I'm going to keep talking about it. So needless to say, because of that, I was happy to see that this was no longer a one-off, and this is now sold across Canada, the US as of the last couple of months, and the UK. So this is here to stay as long as people keep drinking it. Is this available in Texas? It better be, right, Professor?
It is. On that note of where it's available, before everybody starts typing in, is it available here? Is it available here? We have a product finder, and basically it's in our mailer, our trade mailer that goes out every other month. So if you're one of our certification students, you will start receiving that mailer if you wish. And it will be in there. It is updated. That product finder is updated every other month so that as new products come online, this just launched this past fall in only a handful of states, and it's already coming online in a couple states every month. So, keep checking to see if it is available yet in your state. But also, I can send you all, our certification students, I can send you all an email with our product finder so you can look to see if it's available and who the distributor is as well. If you're not one of our certification students and you're wondering, then shoot Dave or I an Instagram message, and we'd be happy to add you to our mailing list, and then you can check that whenever you'd like.
Yeah, I'll say this. Gina's the brainchild behind the mailing lists, and I hate it when I open my email and I get stuff from places I've gone shopping because it's just annoying. We try to keep that to a minimum, that once a month you get an email, but we send you a couple cool recipes to make, and like you say, just information like that. There's nothing overly in your face. It's to help you find out where to buy the stuff, because the US, you guys like to make things a little more complicated south of the border on buying stuff with the 3-tier system. So we've got to do everything we can to help you.
That is true. Okay, I've got a question for you, Dave Mitten.
Mm-hmm.
So Josh is asking if dark oak gets supplemental aging. He's just kind of trying to clear it up, I think.
Yeah.
Gets supplemental aging after the level 2 char into the level 4 char.
Yes. Sorry, I get excited when I talk about this stuff, so maybe I was not as detailed as I should be. Apologies. Yeah, Lot 40, I mean, it goes down to the new American oak. Minimum time is 3 years, the 2 level, and then into the 4 level for under 200 days. It's a barrel finishing whiskey, basically like our Pipe Creek, for production purposes.
And remember last week, for our certification folks, Dr. Don took us through a lot of things about his dissertation. But remember, he said, at a certain point, after you've gotten all of the wood extract, maybe not all of it, but a majority of the wood extract into your whiskey, if you want more of that, it makes more sense to re-gauge it into another barrel, whatever, if it's finishing barrels, if you want more port into it, to re-gauge it after 200 days, or into a new barrel again. If you're going to want more wood extract in that kind of quick incline going in there, and that's exactly what he's doing with this, then you can re-gauge it into brand new oak again after a certain amount of time to kind of increase that a little bit more quickly. We have another question about the steam in a column still and whether it is hot enough to break down lignin. Yes, it is. It breaks down lignin. It's hot. It's cooking your mash, right? Or your fermentation, your beer, I should say, not your mash, your beer. So you're breaking down that lignin. You're creating those spice notes. Remember, a single column distilled rye would be full-bodied and grain forward, much like an American style, or most of your big house American style ryes. It's then, if you take it to a pot distillation, you're heating it once again. So you're going to be breaking down more lignin, bringing more of those spicy flavor compounds to life. You're also, at least at Hiram Walker, we're making cut points. We're cutting out the green grassy notes. We're also cutting out any kind of sulfur notes in the tails, or soapy notes, excuse me, not sulfur, soapy notes in the tails. And so now we're concentrating up where all those lignins, kind of sit, which are in the hearts, those lignin compounds, that spice, the grain notes, the spice from the rye, and the fruity and floral notes as well. So that's why when you pot distill it after a column distillation, you're getting more of those notes coming forward because we're really concentrating that up. But the single column distillation certainly has enough steam. It's breaking down lignin. It's giving you a nice full-bodied spicy rye. And we have a question about casks, but I think we should leave that to Don. He touched on it last week. He didn't really call them honey cask, but he did touch on, superb casks. And that's really what we're referring to here. Part of his answer to this question about, focusing on Shiner or honey barrels is we at Hiram Walker, we don't really bottle single cask. We're not a single cask producer. It doesn't make sense for us. It's not how Canadian whiskey is made. Canadian whiskey is made by blending whiskeys. And so we actually have a program called Signature Series that we do in the US with some retailers, and a few whiskey clubs participate. We've had a few on-premise accounts participate as well, which is super cool. But instead of buying a barrel, they actually go through an entire blending class with Dr. Don and make their own blend. And then they purchase a specific amount of cases. Of course, they're the only ones getting that blend. It has their logo on the label and everything. But yeah, we don't really do like barrel picks or single cask where, you know, a honey barrel would be pretty special. And we'd have to single it out. And in all honesty, we just really rely on getting very good quality barrels. But at the end of the day, we know that we're going to be blending them because that's how Canadian whiskey is made.
Plus, I mean, how much fun is that? Like, you come to the distillery and you make your own whiskey with Dr. Don. Like, you're not just pulling, and you get to pull the barrels, and you pick your barrels and casks with him in the warehouses. It comes back to the distillery, then you blend the whiskey. So it's kind of the best of both worlds.
Mm-hmm.
Let us know if your bar or restaurant wants to do that. We'll
yeah, we love it. And Donnie has a few comments and questions about he would like to get the blender's palette, but we are not sharing the slides. But you have this recording for access to it for eternity, as long as this Facebook page is up and the YouTube channel is up. You do have access to it, so you know, feel free to download it and have it at your leisure to watch. But he also has a comment about the triple barrel rye being super popular in the shaker and spoon group, because they just did in November, they did cocktail kits that went out and suggested lot 40. And a lot of people who couldn't get lot 40 went to triple barrel rye and found they really loved it. So just a nice comment to see as well, that people trying new things, right? We have a compliment or / question for Dave.
Oh no!
Before this experience ends, do you have a podcast or anything? Because you have a great voice for radio and a face for television.
Oh well, I thought you were going to say you have a great voice for radio and a great face for radio, because I get that a lot. Thank you. That's very sweet, very kind. I've had the voice question most of my life since I hit puberty. It's I don't have a podcast, but I get to go on them. I was just on what was the one? Why is it? Oh, it's gone from my head. I can't think of the name of it right now. But it's in California.
Yep.
Donnie or Josh will know it. Booze dancing. Mm-hmm. I just did one. It's out now, Booze Dancing, with a crew in California, and it's talking about Canadian whiskey and John Candy and trains, planes, and automobiles. It was a very Canadian-themed podcast, so thank you. It's very nice.
Mm-hmm. And also, Dave's not telling you this, but he is on a lot of video production for the company, of course. He does have a great voice and a face for television, for sure. But you know, we have a lot of cocktail videos with Dave, and there's even a commercial in Canada. I don't know if that's still playing, the old-fashioned commercial with his voice behind it. So, you know, yes, that is recognized for sure. All right, I think we need to pass it back to Liz before, who knows, we need to end on this high note.
Yeah, Josh, you have successfully made Dave blush. So congrats to you. Awesome. Well, we have wrapped it up at exactly the 1 hour mark. Gina and Dave, you've officially perfected this. Thank you all for joining us for our last class of the Canadian Whisky Certification. Tomorrow is your final workshop. That's with Dr. Don at 3 p.m. Eastern for our 100 Canadian Whisky students. And for the rest of you, thank you again for joining us. And again, if you haven't already, give us a like, give us a subscribe, because we do classes like this all the time. So we love having you. And Gina and Dave, thank you so much for this wonderful 4 weeks of education. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you all tomorrow, like I said, at 3 p.m. Eastern.
All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you tomorrow.
Bye.